This episode of Back to the Roots podcast is brought to you by Byron Seeds. The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds.
You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast, and today we are close to Millersburg, Ohio, and we are talking with Steve Sommers, who boils maple syrup, is a sugarer, I think is the right term.
Yes, sugar maker.
And I am really excited because I've never talked to somebody with this much knowledge in maple syrup. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. And can you give us a little bit of a background of your sugaring?
Sure, Mike. Yes, thanks for having me. Yes, Steve Sommers. We're located here near Millersburg. Sugaring has somewhat been in my blood. Fourth generation sugar maker. My mother actually got me started into it pretty hard because she was driven into it by her dad and her grandfather. So back in the day when sugar was more or less rationed due to the wars and so forth, a lot of people actually produced syrup to supplement their sugar supply that they weren't able to pick up, at the stores and so forth. And she just kind of started around the home farm where she grew up. A lot of large maple trees around the house. Started with pretty much buckets with holes. They weren't even really for maple sap. She would collect the sap into the buckets. My dad, for lack of better terms, glued together a framework that she could use a flat pan to boil the sap down, which was outside and, not protected from the weather or anything. And once you started the fire and you had sap to cook, you just kind of had to keep on rolling with it. And I know she had a few people stop in on occasion, and she was up there in the rain with a piece of tin over her head, and they weren't sure if the sap was actually in the pan or outside the pan. So it's kind of funny, but yeah, from that process, we did haul the sap to a neighbor at that time, which had a regular maple evaporator, but that required a couple miles of hauling on our part after we gathered in the woods. So that kind of pushed them to construct a smaller so-called sugar shack on the farm where we currently live, or where they live at and grew up, and that has the majority of the maple trees, the sugar bush, and everything does gravity flow to that sugar shack, so that's where the sap can be processed a little more easily and not hauled. From a flat pan, migrated or went to a 3x8 regular wood-fired maple evaporator. That lasted for a few years. I got involved more. I was old enough to walk through the woods and carry sap buckets and spill them in the mud because we had the milk cans in a old manure spreader or a wood wagon we had. That's what it was used for. That we had the tank, and we would carry it around and take it down to the building. And then we came across this wonderful thing called tubing, that we could actually tube the trees from tree to tree and then run everything pipeline to the sugar house. So that's a good thing because it keeps traffic out of the woods, especially tractors, wagons. Foot traffic's not so bad, but when you start, monkeying with the roots, and we all know it is wet, it is muddy when the sap runs, it's not the nicest weather conditions, or it can be not so nice. So tubing kind of frees up that process, but there is a maintenance aspect on it. Then also you have to get out into the woods and keep an eye on your tubing, and the technology in the tubing from back in that day till now has changed a lot, including the type and material that the tubing is made out of, but also a lot of other things along the way, including tree health, the old tapping standards. We started with a 7/16 inch drill bit or 3/8, depending on what spile we used. Grim was one of the spiles, and then the other one, I'm not sure what the name of it was, but they required 2 different holes, and we used a bit and brace, hand drilled them. And the most I had ever drilled of that was 440 taps, and that was 7/16 hole or 3/8, and that was quite a few. And then we transferred over to the tubing and went with the 7/16 inch tap, and the standard depth at the time was, they were saying 3 to 3.5 inches into a tree, 8 inches and up. That has all been changed now with smaller spouts, using a 5/16 inch drill bit, which is what I use, and drilling maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches into the tree. They term it a health spout, but it is healthier for the tree because you are removing maybe 1/3 of the wood that you were before you used the 7/16, so that tree could snap back, close better, and compartmentalize itself, because that area that has been tapped above and below it, the sap really doesn't run in that area after you've tapped it, so it needs to put new wood on it and grow out. But there is a pretty significant staining in that wood area where you tap.
So when you tap a tree, like the next year, will you go like, you'll tap the same tree multiple years, but will you go like a quarter turn around the tree?
Yes, we'll move away from the old tap hole. I always kind of thought as far away as you could. A nice little standard distance, a quarter away around, is kind of nice to do. That way it's somewhat systematic by the time you get back around to where you tapped it the first time. It should have produced enough wood to possibly be able to get back on close in that area again. And you don't want to girdle the tree. We move it up. The tap gets moved up or down, left or right. And there's been some research done now where you can actually tap below the lateral line, and they're seeing just as effective yields, I guess, especially I think if you use vacuum.
Do you use vacuum?
I do use vacuum now. So back when we switched to the tubing, we used to take the tubing down every year. The trees all had numbers, and they were lettered. So we'd roll the tubing all up, take it to the sugar house, drag it all back out, lay it back out, stretch it from tree to tree. There was a lot of labor involved. Fittings would get brittle, break, and be patched. And we went to a stay-in-place system where the tubing gets stretched, stays in the woods, stays tight, and that gets left up year-round. And we do run vacuum on that, and we did with the older style tubing too, but the composite, the material it was made of, was not really ideally to be left out in the woods, and there was a lot of leaks at the fittings and stuff. So, but the vacuum was kind of a interesting scenario. Instead of tapping more trees, there was some research done that said, you can increase sap yield by just adding vacuum. So I knew a guy that had an old milker in his milk parlor, had a vacuumizable Monnier bulk tank, and I thought, I can make this work, maybe. So drug everything out, freed up the vacuum pump, hooked it up to the lines, and oh my gosh. So it was just tremendous, the amount of difference in yield of sap that it made.
Really?
By pulled around 15 inches of mercury, because that's what the regulator was set at to milk the cows that was at the barn at the time. But yeah, it made a huge difference. It made it seem like the sap would run faster, but now that I know that, that's not a good thing because that usually means you have an air leak in the system. But we did increase yield and production without doing any more tapping in the woods. So it was actually pretty cool.
So I want to take a step back here because
Sure.
you guys are talking about flat pans and spiles and da-da-da-da. And as a guy that grew up thinking that Aunt Jemima, which I realize is neither a right thing to say these days, nor maple syrup, I want to go back to the very beginning. Like, let's walk through this process of how do you pick out even a tree that is the right tree to tap? How do you tap it? And let's just go through step by step.
So yeah, you look at your woods. I call them gray ghosts. I've always kind of coined them that. I mean, you can just see them. You can see the limb structure from a distance. It's just something you learn after a while. Sugar maple is the most desired tree that people would like to tap, I believe. So I've been told. And that's where I'm going with that. I have sugar maple. I have soft maple. Silver maple. Are those two the same? Possibly. I'm not sure. Can you tap them? Yes. Do I tap them? Yes. It's what I have. You play with the cards that are dealt. So yeah, you find the trees. The silvers or softs may bud earlier in the spring rather than the hards. That's weather dependent. If weather doesn't cooperate, they're all going to be done at the same time. If it drags on, they possibly might bud a little earlier. And the bud will mess with the texture or the composition of the sap and will produce a syrup flavor that's it's off. It won't taste quite right. And a little bit of that can ruin or make a batch, the whole batch, not right. So yeah.
What is the term for? Is it called buddy syrup?
Buddy syrup is one of the terms. There's another one out there I'm not too familiar with. I think I had a little hit of it one year. Metabolite. Okay. It tastes flat. It's just weird. And it's something I'm not sure if they really know what causes it. The trees will just maybe for a day or two kick it out. And that's what you got. You don't know it until you actually taste it. So
because a buddy syrup, when you're running a little bit risky.
Yes.
When you start seeing a little bit of buds, right?
Yes. And once they crack, once the buds crack, that's pretty much game over.
Okay. Now, explain to Brian what a spile is and the different.
Before you do that, let's go to what makes sap even run in the first place, and
that's a good question.
When does it run?
Okay, so the sap, sap can be gathered in the fall. It can be gathered in the spring. The driving factor to make the sap run, so-called, is you're looking for a freeze-thaw cycle. You have to have a freeze, and then it has to thaw. I use this analogy, people that come to the sugar house for tours or just want to see what's going on, what makes sap run. The tree freezes, usually the root system won't, if it's really cold, everything will freeze up. When that happens, it's tough to make things run. We've got to get some thawing going on. But when that tree freezes in the woods and the roots are still not frozen in some moist soil, the gases within the tree itself, and the xylem and phloem, which are the tubes that flow the sap up and down, the gases within contract. Throw a balloon in a freezer, pull it out a couple hours later, what's it do? It shrinks. So when them gases shrink like that, it creates a vacuum within the tree, and that the root system pulls water into the roots. And that's where the starches are actually held. The starches mix with the water. The next day, 2 days, whenever, the tree thaws out. What happens then? Those gases expand. Now we got pressure. And anywhere there's a little wound or a split or a cut in that tree, it's going to push. because there's a pressure differential now from outside to inside the tree. And the tree is, in a sense, getting ready for spring. It needs to make leaves. And if it's like me, I've got, winter reserves in my waist. And so that tree is gathering the starches from the roots and it's sending them to the top to create the buds and get the leaves ready whenever the temperature is right for that to go, and that's the budding. So we're pretty much harvesting or pulling some of the starches that it would use to make the leaves to get going in the spring so it can start its own process and of, leaves and chlorophyll and keep itself surviving through the summer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, Steve, the sap ring on a tree, when you girdle a tree, you cut through the sap ring.
Yes.
The sap only flows up and down in about the outside inch and a half, varying a lot tree by tree.
A lot.
So the inside, the hardwood with inside the tree has no flow?
That's right. I'm not sure on the maple. I know different trees are different. An ash is the outermost ring, and that is it, which is why the emerald ash borer is so devastating on it. It just monkeys up that little bit of flow on the outside, and it's done. The hard maple and maple may have a few inches of sapwood, but if it's a larger tree, yes, that wood that's on in, the heartwood, so to speak, really does not transport any fluid up or down. It's more for structure, and then that's why you kind of see it rotting and stuff too.
And is that why your taps over the years with more research have gotten shallower and shallower? Where it used to be like, I remember drilling way deep because the thought was that you would gather the sap in the back of the hole and then it would come to the spile and run out.
Yeah, that's part of it, along with the addition to vacuum and being able to, I'm convinced, being able to move that sap within the tree without over tapping it. I think that was part of their thinking in shallowing it up and, making it a little more healthy for the tree.
Mm-hmm.
So are you damaging the tree by tapping it? I mean, I assume you're doing some sort of injury, and you're, I guess, are you taking away from the tree? A tree is a living thing, obviously,
correct.
But sap, by pulling sap out of the tree, are you slowing down the process? If you didn't do that, would something happen differently?
I'd go by what they call sustainable tapping techniques. I only put one tap in a tree regardless of size. And the size in diameter starts, I may have a few 10 inches, but 12 inches and up gets one tap. You can put two in, one say an 18-inch diameter tree and higher, but growing up back in the old standards where an 8-inch tree was 1, 12 to 15, 2, well, you do that for about 10 years. Now you're scratching your head trying to find a clean place to tap that tree. So I'd rather just be able to tap it for many more years and be able to pass it on to somebody for many more years, and be able to continue to tap it. And with, the removal of the sap, I don't know how to really answer that. You're taking some of it. Maybe it's just like going to the Red Cross van, but you're taking some of it. I've heard of people over tapping trees. I don't know that you can over tap it to the point where you take so much sap out that you're going to kill it. That's probably possible. I think the effect would be if you over tap it with too many taps, you're just more or less going to girdle it, and it's going to eventually die from that.
Mm-hmm.
But
so pulling the sap isn't necessarily doing the damage. It's the drilling into it that is doing the damage.
I'm gonna say that probably has more to do with it, because that's why they're wanting you to move your tap around, and they're wanting to go lower than the lateral line to get out of the tapped area from before, because it's already restricted to flow. Proctor Maple Research Center in Vermont does a lot of studies on that, and they've looked into does using vacuum actually hurt the tree more, and they really can't say that it does.
So when you tap it and that heals up, that flow right through that area will change?
That's my understanding. They where you remove the wood, that will not flow again.
Okay. Will it just flow around it, or
it may flow around it, or as the tree gets larger in diameter, the addition of it grows out, and then it'll start flowing. There's old trees out there that have been sawn down for timber. I know a few sugar makers that have sawn their butt logs that are taken, and you can still see the tap hole, the complete hole, and they call it tap hole lumber. It's actually pretty nice. So
it is, unless you're a forester and you don't realize they were tapped.
Well, but it has been commanding a higher dollar amount, I think. But
it might be now. It wasn't.
This is where sugar makers and foresters kind of butt heads sometimes. It's like,
Steve,
I want to cut that. No, you're not cutting that one.
Steve, I was a forester for 9 years, so yep, I was not a fan of yours back then.
Yeah. Now I'm sure there's excess hardware that can get left in trees. Drill bits do break, and you can't get them out, and you just leave them in there.
And people also forget to take the old galvanized spiles out.
Yep.
They would just, all of a sudden you'd come up and you'd still see the little bit of the lip of the bottom one, the ones you'd hang the bucket on.
Yeah.
Like, what were they doing? And that is really hard on a saw.
Yeah. So, yeah, the spiles, as Mike was talking there, they were metal to begin with. They went to plastic, which the spile is essentially, after you drill the hole, is the piece that is inserted into the tree that nowadays most people will either attach a bucket to it, it either hangs, or you can set the bucket on the ground and run a piece of tubing from the spile to the bucket, or you're on a tubing system that would, collects the sap from the spile, runs down a piece of tubing called what they drop line. It drops the sap from the spile to the tubing. That tubing goes from tree to tree to tree, and that tubing ends up at what they call a main line, which is generally bigger in diameter, and then that main line collects numerous tubings throughout the woods, and that main line transfers the sap to the collection point or another larger main line and further on. So it's kind of like a big spider web, more or less, if you look at it that way. But there's a lot of different fittings and spiles, but you're still after the same thing.
So for anybody listening, and I know I went through the same learning process of driving around, and you see a bunch of blue tubing running through the woods, going to a 55-gallon drum, which I know these are probably more home brewers, so to speak. I was wondering what in the world is going on there, and that's maple syrup right there.
That would be a collection system for the sap. Yes. Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of ways to do it. I would never want to be the one to write the book on how you should do it. Everybody does it differently. You're after the same end product, so go for it.
So when you go to lay out a tubing system in a woods, like that has to be difficult because it's all gravity flow to the collection point. Or with vacuum, can you suck it up the backside of the hill?
You can somewhat suck sap up a hill. It's kind of like, I think it has to do with the siphon effect. You can only siphon water so far up a hill until it'll tear off, because you're basically working on atmospheric pressure, 14 point some odd pounds per square inch, and whatever that pushes at 2.31, that's all you're going to get. There are apparatuses out there that use some kind of a piston driven off the vacuum that actually kind of shove the sap or pump it somehow. Okay. I am not familiar with those. I don't have any of them. But they do have like a sap ladder, where if you have a few trees in a depression and you only need to raise it, say, 10 feet to get to a normal main line that would free flow downhill to your collection, you can raise it that far. You just use a number of different branch small tubes that just looks like a spider web kind of going from the top main line to the bottom main line, and the sap will go up that and down. Is it ideal? I don't know. It works for people. I don't have any. There again, you use what you have, and you go with it.
And you would basically set yours up so all the little drops from the trees would go into a line over to the main line, all laid out in a gravity flow system.
In a gravity flow system, yes. And then the vacuum is applied to that system to increase the differential of pressure from within the tree to the outside, because you're dropping that pressure at the tap hole where the wound is occurring or has occurred. You're dropping that pressure, and that will, on a day where it's somewhat questionable, there's not much pressure difference between the outside and the tree, you're dropping that pressure at that tap hole, and you're getting a flow. So,
but how do you go about to lay out the tubing system? Do you just look at the hillside, you look at your woods, and you think, okay, down this draw is going to be my one main line?
Start at your collection point. Where's your lowest point in the woods? Where do you want it to end up at? I mean, maybe it's not going to be the lowest point. It's going to be where you want to end up at, where you can get to it to either pump it out, haul it out, and then, you follow the depressions. You can do a systematic layout of your woods where every, depending on the length of your branch lines, which depends on the density of your trees, you can run your main lines, say, every 100 feet apart. You can stripe them kind of across the contour, but say on a 2 to 5% grade, and then your branch lines would come off your main lines. You want them running kind of steeper up and down the hill, and those would catch the trees in between, because 100 feet up, then you would have another main line, and you kind of like tile in a field, but different. So it takes a number of rolls of ribbon, different colored ribbon, because you go out there and you look and you walk, you flag it up. At least I do, especially if you've got a crown or a knoll in your sugar bush, and one side's going to run one way, one side's going to run the other. You got to kind of like find the continental divide and figure out where you want to go from there. And so it can be some head scratching, and you lay it out, you look at it, go up, tear it down, do it again, and say, okay, you're good with it. But the main line, once you figure out where you want to run it, everything mainline wise is strung on a wire. So that is the first thing for me that goes in the woods when I lay out a system. I know where I want it to run. I pull high tensile wire through the woods to an anchor tree or an end tree, and it gets fastened to that tree, whether it's a big J hook that is inserted into the tree, or you wrap the wire around the tree and protect it with extra tubing. And then the main line gets pulled under that wire, and then I go in and then I put the branch lines up before I even fasten the main line, because if there's clips on the branch lines that fasten to the main line wire, and it's kind of hard to do that with the main line against the wire already, plus you have to insert saddles if that's what you're using to get the branch lines into the main lines. It's easier to insert the saddles with the main line not fastened. So once you get the wire run, branch lines ran, you're not putting drops in yet, but the branch lines are ran and tensioned up, then I will tension up the main line with grips, pull on them to stretch the pipe, so you kind of always get a little bit of a wobble in the pipe, or you can. And then you start with the wire ties, and then you fasten the 1-inch pipe, or bigger, or smaller, to the wire with their like rebar tying tools. You twisty ties, more or less, every 12 to 18 inches, or however the mood hits you that day. and you start going down that line. And where you come to a point where there's a branch line going to enter the main line, you either drill a hole in your main line and install a saddle, which is just like a saddle. It goes over the pipe. You're drilling there's two different sizes, either a 5/16 inch hole or a 7/16 inch hole in one side of the pipe on top. You're not going clear through, and you're not severing the pipe clear in half. You drill the hole, the saddle sits on top of the pipe, it is gasketed, and then there's either, I use little screws that fasten, they clip and they squeeze together so they don't come off, and then you keep on going.
So when you say, so you have your main line and then you have your branches.
Mm-hmm.
So you have your main line running, so the branches are running up other little ravines or indentations up to where the trees are.
Yes.
Okay, and then and then off of that branch, you're running more lines to the trees in there, just like a branch of a tree.
Yeah, pretty much so. And if you have number of draws and you want to run number of main lines up each draw, you can, or you can run branch lines off of both sides of your main line. But if you're running them across the side of the hill, your branch lines usually will just come in on the uphill side. Mm-hmm. Comes down to it. So it's all in how your woods lays, and like I say, it's not. You can go a couple different ways. I've done it twice, 2 different ways. I like laying it across the grade and pulling the trees all in from one side of the main line, because if I watch what I'm doing when I set it up, I can leave a path on the bottom side of the main line. It's easier to walk, and you can buzz along there with a 4-wheeler during season, and the branch lines are clear enough you can see the sap flowing, and if it's flowing slow or not moving, you don't have a leak. But if it's sitting there zipping, like you have a vacuum leak up in there somewhere. Okay. And then you go searching for it.
So now we've got the taps and the lines kind of done. Mm-hmm. So now that the sap is at the sugar house or in the tank, what happens then?
Okay, so once the sap is in the tank, and the vacuum has been on, I have 3 different bushes. 2 of the bushes run away from the road, so my collection facility is not close to the road. It's the furthest one is 1,600 feet away from the road, and I'm changing elevation by 160 feet. So I have to push that up the hill and into another tank in the barn, where I gather the sap in a truck then and haul it back to the sugar house for processing. Last couple years, instead of using a gasoline 2-stage centrifugal pump and having to go down and pump the sap up every time, I have a job, I guess. So it makes it a little hard to come home and have to do that and then go gather. It was really, cutting into time. It's just a lot to do when you got to start hauling and pumping. They have most companies have them now, maple companies, but they're Smart Trek. I call them bugs. They're a monitoring device that I put in the woods. I put one at each end of the main lines. And then I also have electricity at my pump houses now, and there's a relay that I can activate with my cell phone to start the pumping process and not even be there. And I can tell the tank levels and how full they are, so I can work on that while I'm still at work. So, but you have a better grasp on what's going on, because there's been times I've woke up in the middle of the night. Is it running? Is it not running? I don't know. How full's the tank? Jump on 4-wheel, run down and look. It's like, oh, it didn't even do anything. Or you're tired, you don't go. You go down, you look, and it's running on the ground. It's like, oh, good grief. So these things do bring quite a bit of peace of mind and the ability to actually start pumping before you're even home and ready to haul. It's kind of nice, and it's a mesh system. You put these in the woods, and then the other thing is if you have a massive leak, these sensors you can see how much vacuum is in each main line. And why is that main line low? Well, I found that a lot of times if you have a leak, the vacuum's not low on that main line. It's like, it was a mystery. It's like, why is this line building pressure? I think I've had some of them, it showed it's like 20 pounds of pressure on the main line. Well, what's going on? Go look, pull a tap, and it'll squirt you right in the face. So I was like, why? So start walking the main line, and what'll happen, what I found, is the main line, you'll find a frost ball. And it's usually where a branch line comes in. Well, that branch line will have a leak on it, vacuum leak, and it's like a Venturi effect. I pull roughly 27 inches of mercury, so it's pretty hard. And it was causing it to freeze. That air coming into that main line and swirling, it would freeze it right up. So anything from that point upstream couldn't run because it was a plug of ice. And that's why it showed that it was building pressure. And so either hold your hand on it for a while or get some warm water, and it'll sound like a slug going down the main line when it lets loose. And then you go find your leak and then patch it, and then you've got it pretty well taken care of. But that's one thing I was never aware of until I put these things in. And it happens more so right when when it starts running for the day. You're right on that borderline of being froze, not froze, and then you introduce that little bit of air and it just freezes it up. So that was kind of cool. But yes, sap gets pumped to the barn, gets hauled to, and these are all stainless steel collection tanks. The one that I use, one side is 1,200 gallon, the other side is 2,600. Those both pump into a 3,800 gallon stainless steel U-shaped vat's what it looks like. Then I take it to the sugar house and then unload it and put it in with the sap that runs to the sugar house on its own. And then at that point, we are ready to start processing the sap.
Now, before you get into that process, the one question I wanted to ask is what makes the sap run slower or faster out of the tree? That freeze-thaw process you said is what makes, and I've talked to guys that make a lot of maple syrup, and oh yeah, sap is running really good right now. Or oh no, we're just not getting the right weather. What is the right weather? What makes that happen?
Right weather. Well, generally, of course, you should have a freeze every few days. I mean, that tree can only be charged. It can only charge itself up on one so-called drink. You can only do so much. And until it gets another freeze, it's really not going to load itself up with moisture again. It's my understanding. So, a freeze every evening would be okay. Every two, yeah, that's good. Maybe 40s, low 40s. And, lower 20s at night, you get that pretty sharp difference. But I have seen the stuff run like mad, mid-30s and rainy and dreary. Now, what happens when you have a weather system like rainy and dreary? What's the barometer usually doing? It's down here low. So there's a larger pressure difference from the tree to the... So bright sunny day, you got a high pressure. Yeah, okay. You'll notice a lot of that also when you're boiling. Sometimes your steam doesn't want to leave the sugar house, and it has to do a lot with the pressure difference too. So.
Okay. That just, because I remember last time I boiled in a little backyard buddy thingy, there were times when the sugar house is completely encased in steam and nothing's going out the top. I always just complained.
Yeah, well, it could be the part of the pressure, did it always do that, or was it just sometimes?
No, it was just every once in a while.
Every once in a while, so we're not really going to be able to blame it on ventilation because, what would have changed? So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, so another question here would be, and we were talking a little bit beforehand, that, a sugar maple is what is iconically known as the maple syrup producer. But there are other kinds of maples. And are there certain kinds or certain trees that will produce better quality sap or more sap? Or is that just kind of determined by what do you judge on?
What do I judge on? Whatever's in my woods. You know,
Play the cards you're dealt,
that's
right?
Right. Some soft and sugar, or some soft and silver maples may not have as high a sugar content as some hard maples. I have heard of some softs and silvers that have a lot higher sugar content than the hard maple trees that I tap. Location of the tree, usually if it's out in the open, more leaves equals possibly more starch, equals possibly more sugar content. You take a woods that is jam-packed full of sugar maples, you're looking at electric poles, power poles with small tops on it. Okay, there's not much food capacity, not very many leaves to make food. So, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's the other part of like the sustainable tapping is crop tree release, going through your woods and actually removing some of the trees that are not desirable. They may be sugar maples, they may not be put together right, they may have a bad spot, but if you release, you take 2 trees down and give a good tree extra room on its side to, push more branches, give it more room, tops aren't touching, produce more leaves, your sugar content's going to go up there. So, yeah, that's a good question.
So is on that note, is there a correlation between photosynthesis that the tree, like the amount of leaves that the tree has, and the sugar content, like the percentage of sugar or the total sap?
I would say there should be. And I've found that out with a few of the trees that I've tested around our place, the ones in the open, around the sugar house that you just tap because you got everything else tapped, generally are sweeter than the ones that are deep within the woods. Now, there is, and I have a few, they're called high-yield maple sugars. They were put out by, I believe, Cornell years ago, where they picked really sweet maple trees and they bred them like seeds, however, and they produce sap, or trees, little trees, and they offered them for sale. And I bought like 300 of them, and I might have 15 of them still around, but they're getting up in size now to where I could possibly tap them and see what's going on. They needed pruning. There was an issue with, I think they kind of like to almost turn into a bush, and that's maybe more my fault than anything. But they're supposed to be really sweet. There's 4, 5, 6% sugar right out of the tree. I might drill one this year, and maybe just a little hole, and take a toothpick, because I have a refractometer, then I can tell just to see what it is. I'm curious what it is. So, but yeah. Photosynthesis, I would say, would definitely help in the sweetness of the sap, and then also the location. If it's out there, again, it's photosynthesis driven. So, yeah.
Do you do reverse osmosis on your sap?
I do.
Can you explain that process?
So we're now into...
We are now
going to the sugar shack.
We're now in the sugar shack.
We're now in the sugar shack. That's where the magic all happens. But you want to spend your money in the woods, because if you don't spend your money in the woods and have a good system, you're not going to be doing much in the shack. So anyhow, yes, the sap is now at the shack. We're getting ready to process it in the evaporator. The sap may be 1.5% bricks off of the hydrometer, which is sap. Sap looks like tap water. It is clear. You can see right through it. You can get a slight taste of sweetness depending on how sweet it is. It's not much, but you can pick it up a little bit. And so when we're getting ready to process, we start the reverse osmosis, which is a machine that is comprised of, there's a couple different configurations. Mine has 2 pumps. One is a feed pump, which is a centrifugal, and that feeds a bigger high pressure pump. That high pressure pump feeds 3 what they call semi-permeable membranes. Those membranes only allow water molecules to pass through the membrane. And then that water molecule gets collected, and then I save that. I put it in a tank. So what does not pass the membrane is your sugar molecules and anything else that might be in your sap. There's some retention of minerals also, depending on what type of membrane you're using in the RO. And then that is what we call concentrate, and that is what we cook. It's actually backwards of what you would use in your house. You drink what goes through the membrane in the house, and the rest is discarded if you have that system. We go the other way. We discard the good water, supposedly, and then use the so-called maybe dirty, but it's not. It's just where it has the sugar.
What percentage of a gallon is going, and what percentage is boiled?
So it is, I run it on the fly. I start it. I usually put the outflow at about 3 gallons a minute of concentrate, just to try to match the speed of my evaporator. So that's a lot of, so we can take 2% sap, run it through the reverse osmosis machine, and pretty confident we can launch that up to 12 or 14% sap.
And when you're saying 2% sap, you're saying 2% sugar.
Yes.
And the rest is water. And
Yes.
you're getting rid of 88% of the water to get it up to or backwards here.
It's hard to figure, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
You take 2% sap. It's called there's what they call a rule of 86. You take 86, it's some kind of a constant. I don't know the technical term for it, but it's a constant. You have 2% sap. You divide 86 by 2. There's your number you were talking about earlier. 43 gallons of sap, and you'll get a gallon of syrup out of that. So you're looking at like 42. So now, if we take 86 and say we take that up to, 12%, you can see we have now just taken 43 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup. Now we're down to around 7.2 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup.
Oh, wow.
So we have removed a lot of water, we have saved a lot of time, and we have saved a lot of fuel. Or whether it's oil, wood, what have you.
I'm just looking at the firewood I used to cut, like, wow.
Well, I trust me, I know, because, a little quick rundown from the 3x8 evaporator we had with no RO. We went to a 40-inch by 12-foot with no RO. Things were getting buried. We couldn't keep ahead. What do I do? I'm not spending the money for an RO. So went out and bought a 6x16 Grim. 6 feet wide, 16 feet long. This thing was a monster. Okay? You needed 3 people, ideally, to fire it right, or at least I did. I always had people wanting to come up there and try to burn the building down. But, it's like throw the wood to it. And I had pallet edgings. That's what we were burning. And, we went through wood like you wouldn't believe. And we had a steam hood on it, and I'm sure there was a lot of other things we could have did. We had forced air grates underneath of it, which, is a squirrel cage blower blowing air up through the chamber of the firebox to get it really rolling. And we could do around a little over 400 gallon an hour is what that unit would
Like
put out.
of sap?
Of sap.
Of sap,
Of
not
sap.
finished product.
Not finished product.
Okay.
So that was getting to be a little overwhelming. Wood was getting harder to find because it was taking a lot. And to keep wood dry and under the lean-to, I needed to reduce my wood consumption. So that's when we looked into the RO. I bought the RO, went down to a 4-foot by 12-foot evaporator, and really saved on wood and was able to keep it, dry and nice.
You're still wood-fired?
Right now I'm actually fuel oil.
Fuel oil.
I am fuel oil. There's, with my job and everything, I needed to go to fuel oil with the wood. I'm not saying I won't ever go back to wood. I really do kind of miss the nostalgia of it, but right now I want to miss that nostalgia. So I just don't have, there's other factors in there because, covering the wood with plastic that's not under your lean-to, and you get the floaties coming down at night, the ashes, because you got the blower running, and you're out there getting wood, next week, and you see this great big melted spot on your plastic tarp, and it's like, what's to keep your sugar shack from burning? Or you get a good stiff northeast wind, and this is not your farm yet. Maybe it won't be, but Dad's hay shed's up there, and if you catch it on fire, it probably won't ever be. So spark patrol, and we've caught the bank on fire a number of different times because it just spits them out on the ground, and next thing you know, you're looking out the windows and saying, "Why is it smoky out there?" But yeah, fun times. But yeah, the reverse osmosis saves a lot of time, a lot of labor. You're just pushing, sap through trying to get it to go through a semi-permeable membrane. And the only thing it could pass is a water molecule. And that water that comes out of that RO that is waste, or I use it to clean up, rinse all I take out goes back through the machine because it is, it is ready to absorb something. The minerals, it is so, denude of anything because it had it all taken out. It is the prettiest blue that you'd ever want to see. I mean,
you can actually buy maple water, right? That
I think you can.
Is that from the RO system, or is that like the steam that's collected, almost like moonshine turned back into water?
It could be both. I am not sure. I know there was some of that being done with collecting condensate off of the steam hood, and I think there may be some places that they're using the RO water. I don't know if they're doing something else with it or just bottling it as it is. I don't know.
So in the system that you have, how many gallons of maple syrup do you average for a season? Because we now know it takes 43 gallons of syrup or sap for a gallon of syrup. After the RO, like 7.2. But where are you on total gallons of syrup?
And then also, before you get to that, let's go through the process of actually getting to the syrup.
Good point, Brian. Yeah, I just want to
now have the RO.
I just always want to jump ahead. Let's get to the finished product.
We want some sugar.
Yeah. So yes, the concentrate, as it's called, comes out of the RO, and it is pumped up into what they call a head tank, which is a tank above the evaporator. Simple enough. The evaporator is started. It is running, and it is a constant flow. Once the fire and evaporation process starts, there's float valves that as the fluid level in the evaporator goes down, it just continually puts more sap in.
So on that, so if I could paint a picture of your evaporator, the sap comes in one end, and then there's baffles where it pushes it around.
Yes, there
so
is.
The finished product comes out the other end, but the continuous flow, because as it evaporates, it becomes thicker and is being pushed by the sap that comes in. So at the other end of the pan, the finished product comes out in a continuous flow.
It not necessarily. Mine will almost come out in a continuous flow because I have a modulating draw off on it. We'll get to that.
Okay.
So the sap enters the back part of the evaporator, which is called the Flue Pan, which is the workhorse of most of the systems, because if you look at the Flue Pan, the bottom of the Flue Pan has like fingers that stick down, and those fingers are full of sap, but those fingers run the length of the Flue Pan. So you got a thin layer of sap back through this pan that is hanging down into the fire. You're maximizing your surface area in that pan. You're not just a flat pan, You got all this surface area back there. And
That's called a drop flue?
drop flue, but there's also raised flue. Same
Okay.
principle, it's just up.
Okay.
So yeah, they're kind of there's some other differences too, but yeah, for simplicity, that's the back flue pan. Maximize the surface area. You get a lot of your boiling going on there, pretty serious boiling. The sap concentrate takes the longest route through the evaporator. So it enters my flue pan in the front left corner. Once it enters that corner, it has to travel to the back of the flue pan. Then it has to travel to the other side of the flue pan through a little cut. And then it has to travel all the way forward. And you're right, as it gets thicker, it will push, but there's also a gradient, they call it, within the evaporator. Where the sap is coming in, it's a little deeper. And then as it's boiling away, it's getting shallower as you kind of go to the front if you're all one level. So you get this gradient going on. So for me, I'm running a raised flue, so I have another float system that takes the SERP, almost SERP, sap, heavy sap, from the flue pan into the SERP pans. Now those pans are flat. You don't want the flues, because you don't want to burn your SERP or your sap that's closer to SERP. But there again, you get a gradient, and there's 4 petitions, and it runs from one side to the other, jumps forward, runs across, back and forth, and ends up at the front corner, which is going to be your densest fluid in that pan at that time. So you keep on cooking. First run of the year, you boil, get, and then you start seeing some coloration. The bubbles of the sap start. Sap bubbles, when they boil, they'll pop. Pretty big, pretty coarse. And as you keep on cooking, you're looking at your SERP, closer to SERP up front. And you'll start getting a smaller, fine, golden color to those bubbles. And then there's a thermometer that we have up front, and it's temperature driven. So we keep watching the thermometer, which the draw off that I have, there's a probe that sticks in the pan into the fluid and measures the temperature. And then as that temperature gets to a predetermined draw off point, which I check with a hydrometer cup, as it gets to that predetermined draw off point, there's a little like motorized valve that will just ever so slightly start opening. Real slow, you can hardly see it. And it'll start trickling out. So what it's trying to do is, you don't want to, it's not ideal to slam a valve open, from what I've been told, and it works really good if you don't. If you slam a valve open, slam it shut, what'd you do? You just created like a tidal wave in that whole thing. So this valve tries to take that ripple effect out and guess what's going on, and once it gets to a temperature, and that's the other thing with oil. I could never do it real well with wood, but I didn't have the technology back then. The steady heat, the constant heat, and then if your RO is kicking out pretty consistent concentrate, that thing, it'll start to draw off. For me, if I'm running the size of a pen, in diameter, there's been some evenings where once it starts running that draw off, it won't quit until I'm done. It just stays steady and things run smooth. That's on a good night. So, but then there's some times where it'll start swinging and batching off, and then if it wants to batch off, then I'll usually try to throttle it back with another valve in between to not let it batch off and start that whole ripple effect. So, but temperature 7.1 degrees above the current boiling point of water. That's where SERP is SERP.
But that has to do with elevation as well, doesn't it?
And barometric pressure. So that's why when it starts coming off, I'll have a hydrometer cup there. I will fill the cup with hot SERP, a couple times, leave it warm up, and then dunk the hydrometer down in it gently. And we're looking at, we're wanting 66% bricks. That's what we're looking for. Some states are a little different. I think some of them are like Vermont maybe 67, but 66 to 67 in that range is what you're shooting for. So,
And that's measuring the sugar.
that is measuring the sugar. So I believe for out of 100 pounds of syrup, there's supposed to be 66 pounds of sugar in it, which would make sense. It's a percentage, so that's kind of where they're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that's evaporation in a nutshell. Whether you're using RO, whether you don't, whether you're using a flat pan, you're using an evaporator, we're all doing the same thing. We're taking the water out of the sap. So there's other things that come out of the sap as you're cooking it. There's niter sand, they call it, and there's some other calcium that stays in the pan and can attach itself, and that needs cleaned out every now and then so you don't scorch and burn your pan. So every couple boilings I may do that, and that's a function of how much you run through. I can get by a couple boilings without having to clean, and then I use that permeate water to clean with, because it'll gobble that stuff pretty much right up, loosen it up and brush it out.
So now that you have the maple syrup, you're setting up a different place where you then break it down into gallons, into quarts, into
Yes.
that. And what other products do you make?
Well, and also while you're at that question too, is there I've seen, I don't know what the technical term is, but you got light and you got dark,
Right.
and you got medium, and you got different
Yeah.
colors.
Well, we're going to start with filtration, because we've just taken the syrup out of the evaporator. Now we got to filter it. So, because there's some, it needs filtered, because syrup that's not filtered, it can be, there can be some gritties in it, the calcium and stuff that's in it. But, so we run it through a filter press. The hotter it is, the better. Generally do that right as it comes off the rig. It's hot enough to process it through the filter press, and then I pretty much barrel it right away, unless I have extra help there to can as we go. But the barrels are filled quick enough, and they're still hot enough. When you bung them, they're hot packed. I mean, it is just like canned. So a sample is pulled at that point before I bung it, and then that is where I got an idea of what's in the barrel based off the sample, and I can grade it. That is pretty much light transmittance. You have golden delicate, amber rich, and robust. They have changed those here this last couple years. There was a couple different standards throughout the maple world, but I think it's all pretty much those three grades now to get some uniformity. It is all based on light transmittance. Flavor does play a factor in it, I guess, but I run with the light transmittance. 75 and up is golden delicate, 75 to 50 is rich, and 50 down to 25 is robust.
And what makes is there something different in the sap that would make the different colors?
There is. It lighter syrup. There's a lot to that. Lighter syrup generally can be made, or is made, earlier in the season. Okay. If you have good flows, things keep moving, things are flushed out, you're good. The sugar that's in sap when it comes out of the tree is sucrose. Plain and simple. Okay. Now we have a week worth of warm weather, and it really didn't do much. It rained a little bit, but we're getting some stuff in the lines, in the releasers. You wash it the best you can. You clean your tanks, you clean your releasers, you can back flush your main lines, but it's tough to get it clear back unless it really goes back into running well. And so what happens, I relate it to cheese. I don't know how to make cheese, but I'm going to say it's going to be like making cheese. It's the bacteria, microbes, work on the sugar in the sap. They eat the sugar, sucrose, and they convert it. It ends up to, I believe it's fructose and glucose. Those will caramelize different when there's heat put to them, which is why you get your different colors.
Okay.
dark syrup, I've learned. Also, lighter syrup may tend to be, I don't want to make anybody mad, it's going to be more watery, thinner. The density can be the same. It'll be syrup. It's good. It's where it needs to be. I have made some really dark syrup, thinking that it was really way too thick, and really viscous. I mean, it's almost like honey. We're getting to that point where you can't hardly pump it, you can't hardly filter it. I'm thinking it's too heavy. I gotta thin it out somehow with sap or something. Put the hydrometer in it. It's right where it needs to be. What's going on? Well, it's the fructose. That's what happens. It gets almost gluey, and it's just the conversion. The microbes convert that sugar, and then when you caramelize it, it's just darker and just acts different.
And it also has a different taste to it.
It does.
Like I've always preferred the darker syrup versus the light amber, because I think the light amber is almost, or is it light amber?
The delicate would be the lightest, and then the rich, but yeah.
Yeah, but I always thought the really light stuff was almost a little boring, where I wanted a little more of the robust maple flavor. Not buddy, but the more maple flavor.
Yes.
But as far as pricing, when you're selling the lighter color, in talking to people that boil syrup, they say that the price is better for the lighter syrup. Is that right?
I don't change my price.
Okay.
That could be.
And I think that was wholesale to somebody.
It could be. Yeah, I think there is a difference in wholesale price there. Darker syrup pulls through in what you're eating it on. If you throw syrup on something and you like using baked beans, or if you're using it in cooking, or you get the maple flavor pulling through in the dark. I think dark syrup ought to be more than light syrup, because it's really hard to deal with. It can be. It's like, come on. But yeah, no, it's you can compare it to a lot of different things. Do you want a Keystone Light, or do you want a Guinness Stout, or do you want something strong, or do you want something not strong? And everybody's palate's different. So I have different people that want different grades of syrup. I generally shoot for the when I rebottle, I'll go for the rich, close to robust. That's where people really seem to like that. And there again, it depends on when you open a barrel and you do your sampling of each one. How much would you mix with the other? That's kind of how I roll with it. You don't want to overpower any of them. So, but yeah, that's.
So what different products do you make with your syrup?
Okay, so different products. Of course, there's the maple syrup in various different sizes and configurations, glass and plastic. The other thing, we have maple cream, is a product that I make, not a lot of. People in this area are not too familiar with what it is. It's kind of like a peanut butter consistency, but it's maple syrup cooked down, treated differently, and then processed or agitated to form a smooth crystal structure that's kind of creamy, spreadable kind of thing. It can be.
I've never heard of it, and it sounds amazing.
It is.
On a piece of toast?
Oh, yeah. Toast. I tell people it's good on toast, vanilla wafers, pretzels. It's even good on sticks. Yeah. So it can be finicky to make. I've had some success doing it, but that is probably one of the more, what I found, crucial products when you're doing confections. Your invert sugar level of the syrup that you're using to make it. And that is part of the dark syrup, light syrup, because your invert sugar, which I do tests for, can inhibit or block the crystallization process when you're doing confections. Sometimes the cream will come out, it'll look good, it'll be good, it'll, I'll have it for a while, it'll sit around, in the fridge or anywhere, and it'll want to separate. Or I've even had the stuff set up in the machine where I've had to tear the whole machine apart and scoop it out with an ice cream scoop. It's just it's crazy to work with. But the other product seem to have a little better luck at maple candy, which is there again just syrup cooked on down further. You're just taking more water out. That's all you're doing, and then processing it through. You can either hand stir it till you start getting the crystallization process growing. It's a lot like chemistry. You're just growing crystals is what you're doing. And then you put it in molds. I use a little worm trough that has a little gear kind of thing in it that agitates it. And I watch it and then fill my rubber molds and leave them cool and set up. I make granulated maple sugar, which there again, we're just taking more water out of the syrup and then beating it until it goes dry. It looks like wet peanut butter when you start. I do use a Hobart mixer for that now because it is really hard on the wrist to do a large batch. I mean, if you're doing a pound or two, that's fine, but
I'm not starting that.
No, because it's once you start, you cannot quit. It's always good to have a buddy around. So, but yeah, you start and you start stirring it. I'll do a little batch up here with a whisk and a wood spoon. And it's really, you'll start stirring that stuff up, and it's, like 265 or 270, depends on what kind of syrup it is. And, it's really hot, and it's bubbling, and it's frothy, and it starts going to this wet goo, and then all of a sudden, it's like, you can't hardly spin it, and then it'll release a second batch of steam. This stuff, you can almost hear it go, it'll burst. And there'll be another wad of steam coming out of it, and then it just pretty much goes to dry at that point. It's hot, but it goes to dry. And you keep stirring it at that, keep your clumps down in your lumps and so on and so forth. So Hobart makes that a little easier. Mm-hmm. But so with those products, the granulated maple sugar, I have started making maple cotton candy, which I use the granulated maple sugar, but I do have to mix that with pure cane sugar to create what they call the floss to put in the cotton candy machine, so it doesn't turn into, I guess, a big gooey ball. But that's been pretty successful, mixing the two together and then, creating the cotton candy. Maple-coated nuts, cashews, walnuts, pecans. There again, you're taking syrup, boiling it up to a certain temperature, pouring it over the nuts, and then agitating. And if you notice, if you agitate this stuff at the right temperature, it crystallizes is what it wants to do. So, yeah. I think that's pretty much it right now. There's some I've done some maple suckers in the past, like a hardtack that involves some corn syrup and molds. It's fun to tinker with. It's almost too much fun to tinker with, but I do like it. It's fun.
Yeah.
So
For the last 5 years, I've been saying I am going to come watch you when you're boiling in the sugar shed, because that's what I want to see. I will be out this year.
More than welcome to come anytime. And, I love being in the woods. There's days, yes, I just want to throw it all in and say, forget about it. But you're out there, you hear, I tell people you can't really sometimes see spring coming, but if you listen, you can hear it. And then that was the same day there was a skunk on the road dead. And if you listen for that, it'd probably go thump, thump. But, when the polecats start getting hit, it's getting close to season 2 because spring's coming. So it's just one of them things. Yeah. But yeah.
Well, and I will say that, Mike is planning to come out for everybody listening, that going to come out and put some video to what it is we're all talking about. But yeah, I mean, this was, Steve, I've had maple syrup in my fridge from people that make it, from farmers that I work with, and I love it and buy it. And the whole process of how they make it has been kind of just, it shows up in my fridge so far.
Yeah.
So I really, really appreciate learning more about the technical side of all this, and it is fascinating. And actually, before we close up, one thing I did mean to ask was, you said part of tubing is to avoid driving over the tree roots, and so soil health is a part of.
Absolutely. Yeah, ask anybody that knows me. I'm very particular of the woods. You know, if you're not supposed to be out there, you don't need to be out there. Yeah, it's soil health and health of the woodlot itself. You know, grapevine control, taking down undesirable species of trees, invasive species. I'm not saying you want a monoculture of maple trees. You want a good, diverse selection. You know, everybody wants to be happy, but sometimes, yeah, you know, it's good to practice those techniques. I'm convinced.
Well, that just sounds so much like what we talk about with every crop farmer and dairy farmer we talk with. We're talking about diversity and not just attempting to build soil health to soil. The principle of organic is healthy soil, healthy crop, healthy people.
Right.
And we're talking about maple syrup here, and it's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So really, really appreciate it. This was awesome. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Really
Thank you.
enjoyed it.
Right.